welcome to a new episode of On Air. Today we are joined by four amazing artists from across the country and also from across the world in a lot of ways to discuss the anthropomorphized vessel. To give everybody a little bit more background about today's discussion is the act of anthropomorphizing is to give human characteristics to non-human objects or animals. So historically, people have used anthropomorphism to better explain their world. So think about the deities that we created around objects and phenomena like thunder or oceans or the harvest. Anthropomorphism is also the giving of names to inanimate objects or assigning human characteristics to it. So think about a stubborn zipper that has a mind of its own and concepts like that. So we are designed to understand human behavior. And even if those behaviors can be unpredictable, it helps us understand and create connections and discern patterns. So how that then helps us is when we attribute human characteristics to inanimate objects, we are allowed to create a personal connection to those objects. And then we can use that connection to make stronger statements about different systems in our society, about concepts of how those systems relate to us as human beings. And therefore they become a more relatable conversation centered around the idea of objects, and art often uses this idea. So in today's conversation, we're also connecting the idea of anthropomorphism to the vessel, which traditionally was a use of object, but vessels have a long history of being anthropomorphized. And when you think about it, even the way that we describe a vessel is in terms of body parts. A vessel has a body, a mouth, a neck, foot, arm, thinking about those ways. And vessels come, of course, in many different materials and different concepts, including ceramics, but thinking about clay, paper, all of those things. And then vessels historically also are a very gendered conversation. The idea of the female body as a vessel and the vessel as a female body, which often partakes in this conversation as well. And it's a very integral, vessels are also a very integral part of domestic spaces, which are traditionally very gendered spaces as well. Just to keep in mind as we have this conversation today. But now I would like to introduce our four artists. So first of all, joining us today is Cammie Staros, our current artist in residence. So Cammie just finished her residency with us, but her exhibition will be featured for until about midway this month. So check out our app online and check out her virtual exhibition, which is, trippy. And we have other on-air episodes that discuss different elements of it, conversations with Cammie. So Cammie, for those of you who don't know, she's based in Los Angeles. She has exhibited at Shulamit Nazarian in Los Angeles, the California Institute of Art in Valencia, the Armory Show in New York, Craft Contemporary in Los Angeles, Otis College and Art and Design in Los Angeles, amongst many others. She was featured in the 100 Sculptors of Tomorrow, a survey of contemporary sculpture by Thames and Hudson, and she received the Guggenheim Fellowship Award this year. Cammie is inspired by Greco-Roman artifacts and uses Western art historical tropes as a point of takeoff. Cammie thinks about contemporary conversations in conversation with these art historical tropes around gender roles, violence, and desire. And Cammie anthropomorphizes the vessel by bringing in a humorous element to her work, defying expectations of how these vessels work and how they relate to the body. Our next artist and previous artist in residence, Fabiola Jean-Louis, is joining here as well. Fabiola was our artist in residence in September. So at the start of our current season, Cammie is closing out our current season. Fabiola is based in Brooklyn and has shown at the Andrew Friedman Home in the Bronx, at Brick Rotunda Gallery in Brooklyn, the Ensemble Museum of African American History in Chicago. And Fabiola has also completed a residency at the Museum of Art and Design in New York. Fabiola's series, Rewriting History, A Black Ancestral Narrative, is about defying the expectations by introducing the Black female body in a conversation from which she has been absent. Dressing her Black models in Victorian gowns made of paper, Fabiola's painterly photographs open up a dialogue about history and identity in relation to race, paper as currency, and fashion as a class system. During her residency, Fabiola worked on different vessels, as well as this corset, thinking about the relationship between the body identity and the idea of vessel as a body. And we had some really great conversations about that, so I'm excited to continue that today. Next is joining us is Jenny Hata Blumenfield. She's based between Los Angeles and Brooklyn. She graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design with a BFA in ceramics. Jenny has exhibited in The Hole in New Jersey, Mana Contemporary in Jersey City, the Craft Contemporary in Los Angeles, the Fisher Parish Gallery in Brooklyn. And she was recently invited to speak as a panelist at the Asian Society in Tokyo, Japan, and was a recipient of the Anderson Ranch Artist-in-Residency Ceramics program. Jenny's work subverts existing tropes of the feminine identity, craft, and liminality through the lens of playful symbolism. Jenny uses dissection to talk about the complexity of cross-cultural identity, and I'm sure Jenny will tell you a lot more about these different concepts in our conversation today. And then the last artist joining us is Herwald Ruhwald. Anders lives and works in Chicago, Detroit. Born in Denmark, he graduated from the Royal College of Art in London. Anders has exhibited with Moran Benderov in Los Angeles, MoCA Cleveland, Clay Museum in Denmark, and Denver Art Museum. He is also in collections at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Detroit Institute of Art, the Victoria Albert Museum in London, as well as the winner of the Sotheby Prize from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And his work considers the relationship between the body and the object, pushing the concept of the vessel as a body as it relates to the materiality, physicality, and the linguistics. Anders considers anthropomorphism from different perspectives of how does the body relate to the object, as well as how does the object relate to the body. So thank you all so much for joining. That was a quick rundown of, a very brief, let me stop sharing the screen. I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. And I just want to kind of start off with a just to start off a general question about how you approach anthropomorphism in your work. And maybe you can tell a little bit more about that.
Oh. I guess I'll start with that question. Well, I use dresses as a starting point. And it's an item that we know how it functions usually in our society. And I take this idea of the dress or the shoes or even the jewelry, and I remove the normal function of that and give it a meaning that speaks to, human experience, as opposed to it just being something that we put on our clothes. So, even though it's not necessarily giving it this human life, on a grander scheme of things, it is still functioning as a vessel where I assign it human experiences. So I'm still speaking to the way that people are and the way that experiences go and how people feel, if that makes any sense.
I can relate to that because I use the physical or the silhouette of the vessel as a symbol as well, as a sort of marker between the marker of that duality of identity and femininity and domesticity. Identity in itself is inherently complicated, and so that symbol of the vessel is really how I start to dissect that.
I think that even before I started working in clay and started working with vessels, I thought a lot about absent bodies and ways of communicating that absence. I also think a lot about the conventions of meaning making, and because vessels have that anthropomorphic history that you referred to so succinctly, Pusha, in your introduction, like it just sort of seems like if you're working with any conception of the vessel, you have to address it one way or the other. And the idea of like utility and inutility had also been something I've been working with for a long time. And so in combination with that sort of absent body, with like markers of a body that's not quite there, a vessel seems both like it fills that gap very aptly, but also again, like the way that I work, it was sort of, I couldn't avoid addressing it.
Yeah, for me, it's a very open question. I think in my work, it's rare that there is an explicit vessel as such, but I often think through the vessel as this sort of possibility that you can play around with. And so this simple idea that through utilitarian objects and things that could be recognized as such, you start opening up a conversation with your audience where I think you begin to, recognize parts of yourself, or there's a sort of a reflexivity between the object and the person. And so for me, I think much of that sort of anthropomorphizing or sort of even like a surreal gesture of like recognizing something that is like something is something that I often look for as a quality in the work, as a way to begin to open up this space between object and audience, which for me has always been the sort of the guiding line in how I approach doing what I do.
Yeah, I think, that this leads really well into my next question, with this idea of the vessel as an object, right? And also of a utilitarian object. What does it mean at the point where the object is no longer functioning or use, or maybe in some ways never was allowed to have that functionality to it? Like, what does that mean as it relates to the representation of the body in your work? And I know, Jenny, for example, you talk about the dissecting of a vessel, and maybe you can start off with that question.
Sure. I guess definitely with the explicit use of the vessel, I'm constantly aware of its duality, but I'm also hyper aware of its perception, how people immediately associate it with function. It has to be, there's sort of historical rules around it just because it's sort of passed through so many centuries and so many mutations, but always in the form of functionality. So when I use it, I really try to cut it apart, dissect it, remove functionality with a lot of the concepts, even remove it from its material association of clay, and photograph it, I print it, I paint it, I do laser cutouts in Lucite. And so all these mutations help me both and collapse the distance between that identity, and again, my hope is to cut it apart so that it can exhibit a new meaning, and dissecting it literally helps me build that narrative.
Yeah, for me in working with paper and making the garments, I think because I make the dresses out of paper and the shoes out of paper, I mean, the dresses are wearable, yes, but they're only wearable for a very short amount of time. They're not going to function the way that an actual garment would function. And so what happens is I use this material so that I can't actually remove that part of the functionality from it. So it becomes something that we know we can usually wear every day into something that is all of a sudden fragile, that's not going to last very long. And the main point for me in my work is to be able to give it the meaning that I want it to have. So it's no longer a dress, it's no longer a pair of shoes, but it's a paper dress, it's paper shoes, which allows my viewers to question, why am I using this material? And so just in them understanding that I'm using that material, it shifts their perspective in a way and starts getting them to ask certain questions about what am I saying? And so by doing that, that automatically just, you know, changes that functionality in what the final product is as far as a dress and a pair of shoes is concerned.
I mean, I think one of the things that I'm really interested in relative to utility is also thinking about what happens when an object is not in use, and so what is that other gap when we are, you know, surrounded by the things that we rely on in order to go through the everyday. But there's a lot of resting that happens in that, and in that resting space there is also then a question of identity that then comes in, I think, where, you know, we begin to then choose what kind of objects that we have around us, which ones are revealed, which are hidden, which one do we, you know, choose to kind of bring forward as part of the sort of entourage that we have when we, you know, create our sort of identity in the world. And so for me, I think the interesting part about utilitarian objects is that they both serve this sort of very straightforward function, but at the same time also is this sort of a whole sort of aura that we sort of create around ourselves. You know, even as I'm looking through these images here, we are all sort of created by these little scenarios that in some sort of way begin to, you know, create some sort of image of who we are as people, or what we think about, or what we're interested in. And so there is this beautiful ambiguity, I think, in utilitarian objects, that one, they serve a function, but secondly, they also create the identity of whoever chooses to bring that object along with them as they go through life.
I think there's also sort of building on that, there's a whole set of assumptions with utile objects. And so sort of taking away that utility highlights the assumptions around an object that the viewer might have. So if you have something that looks like a ladder or chair or crutch but can't support, and like, what is that thing anymore? And what is its meaning? And so for me, I think it like flattens objects into references or into signs in a way, or it goes some distance towards that goal, and activates like a different conceptual register than a functioning version of the same object has in the world. And so I've always been drawn, like since I started working in sculpture, which again was long before I started working in clay, I've always been drawn to useful objects, or sort of potentially useful objects. And, pardon me, and then making like visual analogies between them and non-useful objects, or living objects, or like really useless objects, you know, really like not only making them not useful, but making them like seem like flaccid, you know, seem deflated. And again, I just think that's like a way to sort of shortcut to a kind of thinking in the viewing mechanism, like for your viewers, when you're sort of like constructing meaning, when you're thinking about constructing meaning.
Yeah, so I have a follow-up question to this. Also thinking about how the vessel is a representation of the body, right? And what does it mean when your vessel, and this in some ways applies to all of you, the vessel represents a particular identity in some ways. What does it mean when the use or the utility of that vessel is taken away? What does that mean for the representation of the identity that you're representing? Is that a comment on kind of the freedom or the place that that identity has in the larger conversation? I'm just really curious how you think that the utility conversation and taking that away then translates to the subject matter.
The utility of the vessel, sorry, the identity of the vessel or of the artist or some other identity?
So, thinking, for example, with Jenny, she's talking about, the gendered identity, cross-cultural identity of women, and, talking about her own experience. What does it mean when the utility of your vessel that represents that identity is no longer something you can actually use? And how does that impact the identity of what is behind that vessel?
At least within my work, I kind of feel like that deprivation is sort of, or to deprive somebody of that is necessary to define a new identity, meaning that, like, specifically with clay, it's so associated with the craft identity, which unfortunately has like a lesser perceived value, even though its historical context is just so vast. But to deprive it feels like it can start to lead into another conversation around domesticity, the sort of symbolic ideas of what's attached to domesticity, what's attached to womanhood, what's attached to craft. And so the act of depriving also is the act of simplifying, at least in my mind.
I think it's kind of in reverse for me, because I'm creating the fashion that I'm using, that I'm referencing for these dresses, is not usually connected to Black identity, right? It's not something that we're used to seeing Black women in. It's not that it didn't exist, but there's not a whole lot of that being shown. So for me, the identity as a Black woman is already not in the objects, because I'm not using the fashion that would say that. The opposite of that would be to do something that's completely in African style, right? Then we're talking about an identity that we usually connect to a woman that looks like me. So it's reversed because of that. And what that does is I get to inject the identity that I want into that narrative, which is what the goal is with rewriting history. So it's to start with something that is an old narrative, and then to, I guess if you will, vandalize that old narrative and inject my own narrative. So kind of, it's not reclaiming, but it's kind of claiming that for a moment and reshaping the story so that we can start to think about fashion in a different way, who we think should be wearing something, who does actually wear it, who doesn't, and really start a conversation from that place.
I also think that taking the utility out of my sculptures adds to their identity. And I do things even that like I bore holes through mine that nobody's ever going to see, but I know it's there, because I feel like it's such an important aspect actually of my work. And to me, I think, you know, there's some parallels there and some not, but it points to the way that the objects I'm referencing are like actually seen in a museological context as like objects that are there to be admired, i.e. sculpture, and not the useful objects they were initially intended to be, and that the context in which those historical objects that I reference a lot is so key to the way that they get read. And so my work sort of incorporates that, hopefully, into it. It's like folded into it from the beginning, is the idea. And so for me, yeah, I think that if I understand the question as intended, then the inutility, as I was saying earlier, has this sort of like symbolic function, but it also like references the way that things are, that some things, and specifically the things I'm referencing, are seen.
Yeah, and I think there is also this whole idea of taking something that looks like it could be used something, and then by denying that utility, it also changes its position. I mean, for me, there's always been a lovely sort of disarming thing about working with things that are at least understood to be utilitarian or sitting within that realm. It seems to be more approachable to begin with, and so there is a kind of disarming device that happens by working within that field, and then once you then deny that, then it takes it away from that more commercial realm, or also that sort of more realm of you know, what is in fashion or in vogue or trendy or whatever else, but kind of brings it into this other realm where then it's possible to begin to, you know, discuss identity and utilize these various kind of tropes that sit within how we categorize and recognize and understand objects that we have in our everyday and that we surround ourselves with. And for me, so that's always been this sort of the power of working within that realm is really to situate the discussion in a different way that doesn't deal with the more sort of classic notion of representation, because it is a kind of, you know, you bring people in and you toy them into kind of deal with it, because it's something that seems simple. You know, we can all understand a vessel, we can all, you know what a drinking vessel is, say, but so you bring people in, but then by denying that simple kind of conversation and forcing the audience into this other conversation, I think is a really kind of powerful area that you know, continues to entertain me as an artist, at least.
Yeah, I've also kind of on the tails of that, like I often think about striving for this borderland between something that is recognizable and something that feels new. And I really love when to me, it strikes a balance of feeling iconic, i.e. it must be recognizable on some level, but also feels innovative. And so I think similarly, using recognizable objects as a springboard helps get you to that place where you lure a viewer in with their expectations and then deny them.
Yeah, I really like that, Anders. That actually brings into mind something you said when we talked before about how anthropomorphism is also subjective and how it changes based on the viewer. And I'm really interested, maybe you can speak a little bit more to that and how that subjectivity can change the narrative as well.
Yes, so I think one of the things that I'm very interested in is both the subjectivity of the viewer, but also the subjectivity of place, I guess, or context. And so one of the things that I try to do with my work is to continue to show it in different contexts and in different ways too. And so by that, really sort of explore the multifaceted kind of way that objects are, that it's not only, you know, the object in and of itself, but it is very much conditioned by who is viewing it, but also then when it's being viewed, in what context is it in, you know, what have people seen before they come to that place where it's at, whether it be a gallery or it's in somebody's home or it's in some totally different context, say the studio or whatever. And so there is this sort of, I think, openness that comes with that. I'm really very interested in sort of saying, you know, my work is about this, or it's about that, but it's much more of sort of thinking them as players that can sort of be put out in different contexts, and by that I can start sort of prying out some meaning for myself, and possibly also with the audience. But you know, of course, it's when you're dealing with audience, you rarely really know what the takeaway is. And for me, perhaps that isn't the explicit point as such, to know what that is, but more so that you can begin to create a productive dialogue with the context that you're in, with the objects that you're doing, you know, and just in the simple ways that some of the, you know, objects that we have that are older, say, that have lived through generations of people, say, you know, those objects have had very different context to be in, and also interpretations, I'm sure. I think I'm really interested in how an object has this sort of autonomy with it, that continues to be re-understood as it goes through space and time.
Yeah, and actually, you know, the idea of the subjectivity, when we were working with Fabiola on her exhibition, we talked about that a lot too, and kind of the idea of, for white women, it was really easy to envision themselves in those dresses, right? But then how to change that dialogue and take us out of that, and Fabiola had, you know, has exhibited the dresses in several different ways, and at Lux we placed them on palettes to bring in that subjectivity about the narrative and the history of slavery, and that narrative, which was, I don't know, Fabiola, if you wanted to talk more about that. Or
it was a very interesting, because it is subjective, this is true. At the same time, what you're also dealing with is expectations. You know, the viewer comes in and they have some, pardon the noise in the background, but they have some expectation of what they're going to see. And once they see it, they still hold on to those expectations, right? Because when you're disrupting old narratives, you know, you find that some people will be a little uncomfortable because it's not, they have to do a little bit of shifting. And when we put the palette wood underneath the dresses to really say, okay, this is an old narrative that we're interrupting because we're using this dress to talk about this history. There were quite a few interesting reactions to that, because while you did have white women who saw themselves in these dresses, you also saw them kind of shift in that and say, but there's so much more. There were people that wanted to have conversations about why are you presenting this story about history through this European lens. And so what I found was that it really did open up a lot of dialogue about the subject, about our expectations, and about the interruption of all of those things to formulate a whole new, you know, way of thinking and feeling. And to be honest with you, I never see, and this is not part of the question, but I think it's important anyway for my work. I think that when I'm creating, that's definitely something in my mind, right? Is considering how this work may or may not impact people that see it. And I feel like I've really done my job as an artist when those are the types of reactions that happen. When the subject is you know, the thing that I'm talking about really impacts people in a way that automatically kind of takes them off their seat. And I think that generally art should do that. It should really shake people up in some way, whether it's, you know, positive, negative, whatever. I think that's the goal, definitely for me. So yeah.
I think I also want to talk about the concepts of masks as well, and this came from your work and the body of work that you did around the vessel, the mask, the body, the skull. I think I took that out of the right order. But the idea of the anthropomorphized vessel as a mask, and then the idea that masks function in different ways, right? Either they are about taking on a different identity, obscuring your own identity, or symbolizing a version of an anthropomorphized characteristic, such as bravery, wisdom. So I'm really interested, and I know, Cammie, you've also talked about one of your pieces kind of functioning as a mask. So kind of these ideas around the mask, the obscuring of identity and sharing. Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Cammie?
I didn't expect me to get thrown in there at the end.
Sorry.
So I mean, I've dealt with masks in a couple of different ways. I think the first way that I engaged any masks was to display vessels in a way that I felt like was a conventional display of African masks, and to deal with this sort of like difference and gap in those conventions of display by combining them, and to point to the sort of arbitrariness of those conventions, and again how deeply rooted they become in in viewers' like expectations of what they're going to see. And more recently, I've made pieces that are, I mean, in some ways similar, but like that function as both vessel and mask, possibly. There's also a long history of that in, again, some of the work that I reference most frequently, like in the Greek wine cups, which maybe I think you can see behind me in the aquarium vitrine piece. There's like a conjoined one, but they're these communal wine cups that often have eyes on the outside, and are called eye cups in those cases. And there's two thoughts of like why that may have been, but it's based on, seeing if I have one nearby. And it's based on when a drinker would pick up this really big communal wine vessel with these big eyes. And so it becomes like a mask for the drinker. And the ideas, there's two ideas, but they're like kind of the same one, that it's either a playful sort of drinking game, or that it is to keep your eyes on your enemy who might be sitting across the table from you, so they don't try anything funny. And so again, like I use eyes in particular in my work, but sort of like relating to that history, as well as lots of other ways that these like simplified eyes have come in through other art histories. But I like playing with the things that the vessels have done for a long time, but doing them in more contemporary ways. So I've like cut vessels open to make them sort of mask-like, but hopefully like honoring that long history of there being something that was sort of both vessel and mask for millennia.
I love how your shirt is also covered in ice.
Also, how could I not?
Anders, did you want to respond to?
Yeah, sure. So the show that you're referencing, I think it's called "The Vessel is a Body, is a Skull, is a Mask." The way that the masks functioned in that show was that there were two lines of masks that were really just simple sheets of clay. On one side, there were like two holes just poked through, like really kind of crudely with my fingers as I was making. And on the other side, there were no eyes. And then there was a range of kind of glazing systems that were going on with them. Oh, there you go. And so as you can see, there was then two sort of more amorphous objects in the middle of it that pretty much had the scale of my own body. And then that little sort of darker thing that you see on the wall there is a rough outline of an ear. So there was an ear on either side of the gallery as well. And so what I was trying to construct in that whole show was sort of similarly to what you said, Kush, in the beginning, this sort of idea that you break down the vessel into various parts. Here I broke down the body into various parts. You had like body as mass as the two objects, body as face as the masks on either side. One being sort of aggressive, the other less aggressive, I guess, depending on whether it had eyes or not. And then at the end, then the ears, but instead of the ears being sort of pointing outwards as they are in our head, they were turned inwards. And so in that way, I was trying to kind of think about the gallery as sort of the interior of your skull, this sort of idea of this sort of perceptive room. And so for me, it became a sort of a play around those things. There was some plays on language as well, and other aspects to the show, but I was interested in playing around with these various sort of gestures and ways of representing the body as a way of activating the audience and having that sort of self-reflexivity going on as you were sort of taking in the show.
Yeah. I want to encourage, if anybody from the audience has questions for our artist, please put them in the Q&A. But I want to kind of open up, see if Jenny or Fabiola, if you have any thoughts on the mask as well, or any other thoughts you want to share about the anthropomorphized vessel.
I have many, but I'll let Jenny go because I'm still processing it. Because my work is leading into masks, and rewriting history is just one project. So it's not that it's difficult for me to answer, it's just that I'm unpacking so much about the mask and what it means, and specifically in African culture, and all the references that I'm using right now to inform the new body of work that I'm creating. What I can say is that I did just release a new project called Atonement. And this work really is more spiritual, because in rewriting history, there was one piece, Marie Antoinette is Dead, where the subject is sitting next to a very small altar. And that part of the story and Black identity was something very important for me to eventually talk about in the work. So I used that image as inspiration to piggyback off of to create Atonement. And so this work is really looking at religion, practices, spirituality, the altar, the vessel, masks, and me being a Haitian woman, how does that all overlap in my own culture? And so the first image that I released really was looking at the Pope, the papal headpiece, and turning that into a mask, which is actually sitting right behind me. So this thing really just covers the whole face, almost the entire face, and leaves the mouth. And the reason why I brought that up is because it's interesting. We're used to seeing masks that also show the eyes, because that's kind of like the window to the soul, right? But I found it through this work, in my analyzing of the mask, I am very curious about what it means to remove the view of the eyes. What does that do to the viewer? Does it make them feel uncomfortable that they don't know who this person is? And what kind of journey, are you creating for that person to take to tell that story? And so I think that's something where my work is going, where when it talks about the mask is removing of the eyes, shielding the face in a way where we really have to use other things to talk about spirit and so many other things. So that's as much as I can say about that.
Somebody from the audience asked if we could see the mask closer up. Is that possible?
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So this is paper with gold leaf on it, 24 karat gold leaf. And the piece that I'm referencing is also on my Instagram, and it's titled Paradise Lost. So, and in that there'll be more information on the post as far as you know, that piece. And I plan to add more. There's so much more that's coming as far as you know, using the headpiece to bring it down as armor and mask.
Jenny, did you have any thoughts on the mask or?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. You know, I've thought about the mask in terms of performance, a way to sort of take on another identity other than one that is sort of pre-assessed. And I identify with that so much, mainly because of the cat.
No, sorry.
Identify with that performance. You know, it's a very, I think, sensitive subject in terms of like my own relationship to femininity, and one that is sort of rooted in dual identity. I'm half Japanese, I'm half American, and yet one half of me gets erased by the other just purely by assessment. And I think because of that duality, I am drawn to this idea of performance and what it means to play into that assessment, and what does that mean in relationship to the work that I'm making and the narrative that I'm building. So although none of it is really like explicitly using a mask, I feel like they all individually are a mask for a particular identity that really hasn't, that is sort of just removed from what is assumed of it.
Thank you so much. I want to leave some time if anybody has some final remarks, but otherwise I want to thank all of you so much for joining us today. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing, you know, how future projects are going to shape, and kind of keeping this in mind. But did anybody have any final remarks that they wanted to make? Or?
Well, I guess what I wanted to say is thank you for asking these questions, Yusha, because I don't know, I think for me, it's one thing to be the artist creating it and being in my own world, and knowing why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. It's another thing when someone asks a very poignant and important question to have me maybe process that work in a different way. And I think that's really important for me. So thank you for that, because even though I know what it is that's happening in my process, in my journey, I think sometimes it's important to just get that outside question that might have you find another facet to look at. So.
Well, thank you for joining us and sharing. I always love hearing your thoughts, and I really enjoyed all of your contributions today. I think, you know, they're incredibly thoughtful and very interesting and very important, and make me think about a lot of things and the current situation and how all of these relate to everything that is going on right now, and how the body and nobody is actually physical anymore. So
Right.
Yes, that's a whole nother webinar, I think.
I know, seriously.
If you haven't had it, you should have it.
All right, everybody, thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you all a wonderful day, and see you soon.